The voice in your head is not you. Carl Jung observed that the psyche is not a single kingdom ruled by one clear voice, but something closer to a parliament of half-strangers, most of whom have never been formally introduced to each other, and one of them has been running the meetings without a name tag. There is an old fragment from Heraclitus that Jung returned to more than once. Character is fate, and Jung was drawn to it because it names something the modern person resists. We like to think character is a single unified will, steady and self-authored, when in truth character is built from many small centers of feeling and memory, each with enough force to steer the ship for a while, without ever asking the one who is supposed to be captain. And if that is true, then some of what you call your own thinking this week was never fully yours to begin with. It only wore your voice the way a guest wears a borrowed coat. Before we go further, if this way of thinking is useful to you, I would love for you to subscribe so that tomorrow's teaching finds its way to you as well. The first key is, the voice that answers, before you decide, is not always you speaking. Jung called these interior speakers complexes, and he was careful with the word. He did not mean neurosis. He did not mean weakness. He meant something closer to a splinter of the psyche, a cluster of memory and feeling and image, strong enough to act with a will of its own. He wrote plainly that complexes can have us, which is a strange sentence until you notice how often it is true. Imagine an ordinary Tuesday evening. You are tired. You walk in the door. Your partner asks a small, harmless question about whether you paid a bill, and before your ordinary mind has even finished hearing the sentence, something in you has already answered. Sharp, defensive, faster than thought. You did not sit down and reason your way to that tone. You did not weigh the evidence and conclude that irritation was the correct response. Something else got there first and used your voice to speak, and afterward, in the quiet that follows, you may even wonder where that came from. That is the tell, because your own considered thinking has a certain pace to it. It deliberates. It doubts itself a little, but the complex has no such patience. It answers instantly, and with total conviction. So this week, the practice is small but exacting. Notice not what you think, but the speed and the heat of what answers before thinking has even arrived. The sentence that leaps out ahead of you is rarely the whole of you speaking. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will notice the voice that answers before I do. I will notice the voice that answers before I do. The second key is, the delay in your response is more honest than the words themselves. Jung tested this early in his career with what became known as the word association experiment. A list of ordinary words, mother, money, door, death, read aloud one at a time, and the patient asked to answer instantly with whatever came to mind. What Jung measured was not cleverness, it was time, the lag between the stimulus word and the reply, because on certain words the answer came instantly, and on others there was a strange hesitation, a stumble, a wrong word, a flush of color in the face, sometimes even a change in breathing that the patient never noticed in themselves. And Jung noticed that these delays clustered, not randomly but around specific themes. In one case, a young woman kept faltering on words connected to a small theft, 70 francs gone missing from a household she worked in. She had denied any knowledge of it, but the stopwatch did not lie the way her mouth had. The hesitation gave her away before her conscience did, and she eventually admitted what had happened. Now imagine a far smaller version of this happening in your own kitchen this week. Someone asks you an easy question. How is work going? How is your brother doing? And most words sail through you without friction. But on one particular word your tongue catches, just slightly, a half-second longer. A joke instead of an answer. A change of subject that felt smooth to you but looked sudden to the person watching. You will likely explain it away afterward. You will say you were simply tired, or the question was oddly phrased, but Jung would ask you to notice the catch itself before you explain it away, because the explaining is the mind's fastest reflex. The excuse arrives before the honesty does, and the excuse is almost always more polished than the pause. That is the tell. The smooth answer sounds better and reveals less. The halting one sounds worse and reveals everything. This is why Jung came to trust hesitation over fluency. A complex does not announce itself with a confession, it announces itself with friction, a stumble, a joke that lands a beat too fast. A subject changed a beat too quickly. So this week, you do not need a laboratory or a stopwatch of your own. You only need to notice where your own sentences catch, where the easy rhythm of conversation suddenly requires effort. That small catch is worth more than a week of confident explaining. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will trust the hesitation more than the smooth reply. I will trust the hesitation more than the smooth reply. The third key is, each complex is not a stray thought, but something closer to a small personality inside the larger one. Jung described the psyche as capable of splitting into what he called splinter psyches, each with its own memory, its own emotional charge, its own partial will. And this is worth sitting with, slowly, because we are trained to think of the self as one continuous thread, one narrator running from morning to night, when in fact the self is closer to a household with several occupants, most of them quiet most of the time, until a particular key turns in a particular lock. Imagine a composite figure, a calm and capable manager, even-tempered in every meeting, generous with his staff, patient with difficult clients, and yet the moment his younger brother's success comes up in conversation, his voice changes register, his sentences shorten, his jaw sets. He is not choosing this reaction the way he chooses what to order for lunch. A whole cluster of old comparison and old inadequacy has been switched on, complete with its own logic, its own memory of every childhood slight, its own conviction that it is simply telling the truth. Notice that this splinter does not announce itself as a splinter, it presents itself as the man's honest opinion, formed on the spot, when in truth it has been fully formed for 20 years and was only waiting for the right word to summon it. Now take a second, smaller, more ordinary picture. Imagine a woman who is warm and unhurried with her friends, who prides herself on patience, and yet who feels something clench in her chest every time her mother-in-law rearranges the dishes in her own kitchen. A small thing, a trivial thing, and yet her voice comes out clipped, almost cold, before she has decided to be cold at all. That clipped voice is not new. It did not arrive that afternoon. It belongs to a much younger version of her, who once felt her competence questioned in her own home. And that younger self has been waiting, fully intact, for the dishes to move again. This is what Jung meant by a splinter psyche. It is not a mood. Moods pass through the whole personality evenly, coloring everything a little. A complex is localized. It has a subject, a shape, a history, a specific age it seems frozen at, and when it is triggered, it does not borrow a little of your attention the way a passing worry might. It takes the floor entirely and speaks as if it were the whole of you, using your full vocabulary, your full memory, your full authority. Here is a third picture, smaller still. Imagine two old friends meeting for coffee after years apart. The conversation is easy until one mentions, almost in passing, a mutual acquaintance who married well and travels often. And something shifts at the table. The other friend's smile stays fixed, but her replies grow short, clipped, faintly bitter. She will later describe herself as simply tired that day, simply distracted. But tiredness does not have a subject. It does not aim itself at one particular name, spoken at one particular table. Only a splinter does that. Only a splinter waits years in silence, and then answers the instant its own theme is touched. And this is worth naming plainly. A splinter psyche behaves less like a passing cloud, and more like a sleeping tenant who keeps the lease current, even while never once appearing at dinner, until the one topic that belongs to it enters the room, and then it rises fully dressed, fully certain, and speaks with your mouth as if it had never been asleep at all. This is why people so often say afterward, "That wasn't like me," and they are more correct than they know, because in that moment, it genuinely was not the whole of them speaking. It was one splinter, fully formed, fully convinced, wearing the entire authority of the self for as long as the scene required. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will name the splinter instead of mistaking it for the whole. I will name the splinter instead of mistaking it for the whole. The fourth key is, the complex does not need your permission to speak, it only needs your mouth. This is the part people find hardest to accept, because in the moment of speaking, you feel entirely sincere. The words feel like your own considered opinion. The anger feels perfectly justified. The criticism feels accurate and even restrained. But sincerity is not the same as authorship. A complex, once constellated, recruits your intelligence in its own service. It will find you good reasons, plausible reasons, reasons that sound like wisdom, for saying the sharp thing to your spouse, for withholding the compliment from your colleague, for assuming the worst about the friend who has not called back. The ego believes it is reasoning freely, when in fact, it has been handed a script and asked to perform it with conviction. And this is what makes a complex so much more dangerous than a simple bad mood. A bad mood announces itself. You know you are irritable. You can feel the weather of it. But a complex disguises itself as reasoning. It hands you footnotes. It hands you evidence. It makes you feel like the calm one in the room, even while it is doing all the talking. Imagine an ordinary Sunday phone call. A grown man calling his father to share a small piece of good news. A promotion, a modest raise, and within 2 minutes, the father is talking about a cousin who did better, faster, younger. The son feels something rise in his chest, and what comes out of his mouth is not what he intended to say at all. He meant to simply share the news and let it stand. Instead, he hears himself listing his own achievements in a defensive tally, correcting the record, proving a case nobody actually asked him to prove. He hangs up feeling drained and slightly ashamed, wondering why a happy call turned into a courtroom. The answer is that an old complex, built across decades of never quite being enough in that particular house, took the receiver out of his hand the instant the comparison was made. It did not ask him first. It simply spoke, and it spoke fluently, because it has had a lifetime of practice. This is the pattern to watch for in your own week. Not the loud dramatic outburst, but the quieter moments when you find yourself explaining, justifying, defending a position you did not choose to take up. The complex is patient. It waits for the specific word, the specific tone, the specific comparison that touches its old wound, and then it borrows your voice with total confidence, offering arguments so smooth you mistake them for your own settled convictions. Jung insisted that self-knowledge required more than good intentions, because intentions are drafted by the ego in quiet moments, alone, with time to think, but complexes right in the margins, in real time, under pressure, in the middle of the sentence, without asking. And the only defense available to you is not willpower in the moment. Willpower arrives too late for that. The defense is knowing your own margins so well beforehand that you recognize the handwriting the instant it appears, before you have finished agreeing with it. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will ask whose handwriting this is before I believe the sentence. I will ask whose handwriting this is before I believe the sentence. The fifth key is, and here I want to turn this directly toward you, because it is easy to nod along while picturing the sharp-tongued colleague or the composite manager, and forget to ask the same question of your own evenings. So ask it now. Think of the last time a small mistake, a typo in an email, a missed exit on the drive home, a forgotten name at a gathering, produced in you a wave of self-contempt entirely out of proportion to the size of the error. That flood of, "You always do this, you never get anything right. Why can't you just—" Notice the tone of that inner sentence. Notice whose voice it actually resembles. Was it flat and reasonable, or did it have an old shape to it? A parent's exasperation, a teacher's sigh, an older sibling's contempt, borrowed whole and replayed as if it were your own considered judgment of yourself. Imagine an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary evening, a father reaching for a glass of milk for his daughter. The glass slips. Milk spreads across the counter, And before he has even registered the sound of it hitting the floor, a voice inside him says, "You clumsy fool. You can never do one simple thing right. And here is what matters." That voice does not sound foreign to him. It sounds exactly like his own considered opinion of himself, delivered instantly, with total conviction. And yet if you trace the cadence of that sentence back far enough, you would find it was never his at all. It was his own father standing in a different kitchen 30 years earlier, saying nearly the same words over a dropped tool or a bent nail. The son absorbed the tone long before he understood the meaning, and now the tone speaks fluently, using the pronoun I as though it had earned the right to represent him. This is a complex speaking in the first person, and most people never question it, because it arrives instantly, at full volume, wearing the authority of self-evaluation. But self-evaluation and complex are not the same thing. One is measured, weighed against the actual size of the event, a dropped glass answered with a dropped glass-sized response. The other is inherited, answered with a lifetime-sized response to a moment-sized mistake. And you can learn to feel the difference in your own body before you even pass the words. The measured response has a certain quiet weight to it. It says, "That was careless. Clean it up." The inherited response arrives hotter, faster, and total. It does not stop at the milk. It moves immediately to your whole character, your whole worth, your whole history of failing. That jump, from one spilled glass to an entire verdict on your being, is the signature of a complex and not of judgment. Judgment stays proportional. Complexes never do. This week, when that inner scolding arrives after some ordinary Tuesday error, a wrong turn, a forgotten reply, a burnt dinner, pause before agreeing with it. Ask simply, is this actually my measured judgment of what just happened? Or is this an old voice that learned long ago how to sound exactly like me? The asking alone does something. It does not silence the voice immediately. Complexes are not dismissed by a single question. They do not dissolve because you have named them once. But the question interrupts the automatic agreement. It puts a half-second of daylight between the accusation and your acceptance of it. And that half-second, small as it looks, is where a sliver of ego returns to the room. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will question the harsh inner voice before I obey it. I will question the harsh inner voice before I obey it. The sixth key is, the aim is not to silence the complex. The aim is to know it so well that it can no longer act in the dark. Jung was clear on this point. Complexes are not expelled the way one might banish an intruder from a house. They are, in a sense, permanent residents. They hold real material inside them, real memory, real emotional truth. Even the harshest inner critic is usually guarding some genuine standard that is worth keeping, even after you have seen through its tone. So the goal was never exorcism for Jung. The goal was relationship, and relationship takes time the way any real acquaintance takes time. You do not become familiar with a difficult neighbor in a single conversation. You become familiar with them across years of small encounters, learning when they are likely to knock, learning what tone of voice means they are simply tired and not truly hostile. The same is true of the complex that lives inside you. Imagine a woman who has been married for over a decade, and every few months, without fail, a small comment about her husband's attention to a co-worker sends a wave of old jealousy through her. Sharp, certain, entirely convincing in the moment. In the early years of the marriage, this wave would simply take her over. She would accuse. She would withdraw for days. She would feel afterward that some stranger had used her mouth and left her to clean up the damage. But across many repetitions of this same pattern, something slowly shifted. Not because the jealousy stopped arising. It still arises. The complex is still a resident of the house. But she began to recognize the particular heat of it the moment it rose in her chest. She began to say to herself quietly, "There it is again." And in saying that, something changed in the balance of the room. The complex still spoke, but it no longer spoke unopposed. It spoke in the presence of a witness, and a witness changes behavior even inside the psyche. This is not a dramatic transformation. There was no single afternoon when the jealousy vanished and never returned. But her husband noticed, across years, that the accusations grew shorter, the withdrawals grew briefer, and eventually she could say the true sentence out loud instead of the borrowed one. "Something old in me just woke up. Give me a moment." That sentence alone was the fruit of a long, unglamorous acquaintance with something that once ruled her completely. Think of it less like defeating an enemy and more like finally learning the name of a housemate who has been quietly rearranging your furniture for years without ever introducing themselves properly. Once you know the name, the rearranging does not stop. The furniture still moves from time to time, but you notice it happening now. You notice the hand that moved it, and noticing is already its own form of authority. This is slow work, unglamorous work, comma by comma rather than lightning bolt. There is no single session in which the voice inside you becomes fully yours and remains that way forever. But each time you catch the disproportion in what it says, each time you name the old scolding for what it is, each time you ask whose handwriting this really is before you sign your name to the sentence, the ego reclaims a small amount of ground it did not have before, and the complex, still present, still capable of rising again next month or next year, has gained one thing it did not have when it ruled unchallenged. It has been seen, and to be seen, even by the very self it has been quietly speaking through, is the beginning of something Jung considered close to freedom. Not the freedom of having no complexes left, no one arrives at that, but the freedom of no longer being ambushed by your own house. So let this be my quiet resolution. I will keep the light on, for whoever speaks inside me. I will keep the light on for whoever speaks inside me. Here is the whole picture. The voice that answers first is not always the whole of you. The delay before your reply tells the truth your words may not. Each complex is a splinter with its own memory and its own will. It borrows your mouth without asking your permission. The harsh voice after a small mistake is often inherited rather than earned. And the way forward is not silence but recognition, not exorcism but relationship. None of this makes you fractured beyond repair. It makes you, like every psyche Jung ever studied, including his own, a house with more rooms than you have visited, and the visiting itself, patient and unhurried, comma by comma, week by week, is most of what he ever meant by knowing yourself. If this stirred something in you, sit with it this week.